The Chief by Richard L. Elsliger. Road pizza. Now there's an interesting slice. Billy Kerrigan examined the long red streak on the highway and wondered, was it a dog? A coyote, perhaps? No, couldn't be. His eyes focused on the crusted pulp of tissue clumped at the end of the road stain. Must have been something pretty frickin' large. The desert heat had sizzled the remains, baking whatever it was into the crevices of the blacktop. Billy shrugged and stuck out his thumb in a pointless exercise. US 66 was a lonely stretch, a disused highway on its best days. Not much chance of hitching a ride out here, but there was always a chance. Nary a car had passed Billy in the last hour, and the ones that did pass him by did exactly that, pass him by. The desert heat beat down heavily on his flimsy wisps of hair, baking the follicles and making his head pound. Beads of fluid sweat trickled down his cheeks. He had to get out of the sun. He needed a ride, and right about now, anything would do. The desert was a quiet place, a virtual sound vacuum. Billy shifted from one foot to the other, the crunch of pebbles beneath his boots the only company of sound at the shoulder of the road. The last car he'd seen passed by at least a half an hour ago, a minivan packed with its family contents, an unlikely ride for a denim-clad drifter. They scarcely glanced at him and drove on with no reduction in speed. A predatory bird circled overhead, catching convections of heat beneath its wings, soaring and descending, gliding and waiting. Maybe the red streak had been one of those birds, he thought. Billy paused again to reevaluate the dead artifact. Maybe it was... Billy's thoughts were diverted from his speculations by a dim sound off to the eastern horizon. It began as a low-pitched rumble, slowly escalating to a high-pitched whine, a heavy chain spinning on its sprocket. It appeared between waves of rising heat coming off the blacktop, a solitary headlight piercing its beam between the squiggle lines. Then a mass grew and formed a shape behind the headlight. Motorcycle, Billy thought. Fat chance of getting a ride. The throaty rumble advanced on him, its mechanical tune suggestive of something rather vintage. Billy loved motorcycles. Loved them his whole life. What kind was it, he mused. It had to be old. The primitive note of the exhaust indicated a Harley, and certainly not a crotch rocket. But then again, Harleys had a more distinctive sound, commonplace to present-day roads, unlike the noise coming at him now. This was the sound of something more ancient, much more ancient indeed. The machine grew larger in his sights, and he vigorously thumbed for a ride. Now the cycle was upon him, and it was more than just a motorcycle. It had an attachment that grew out of its side. A sidecar. Wow, what luck! Perhaps his fortune was about to change. Dark green paint adorned the body parts, and large fenders cloaked front and rear wheels. The alien rumble of the engine was more obvious now, a 74 cubic inch flathead, a V-twin. He'd seen pictures of this bike in magazines, but never with a sidecar. Well, I'll be damned. It's an Indian chief, Billy muttered. The cycle slowed, the engine's high-pitched whine returning to a throaty rumble. Its rider downshifted, and the bike sputtered in response. The chief drove onto the shoulder and coasted to where Billy stood. The rider stared at Billy, but said nothing. Billy stared back, waiting for a comment, a word, or merely a grunt. Seconds passed with not a word between them. Billy sensed he was being assessed by the biker, evaluated for some unknown purpose, no doubt to see if Billy was a safe bet. The biker relented at last. Looks like you could be using a ride. The biker stared at Billy, his face thawing from austere skepticism to assume the pleasantries exchanged by strangers. Damn straight, said Billy. Get in the sidecar, it's empty. Just toss your bag inside first. Hey, thanks, man. The sun is killing me out here. I didn't think I was getting a ride from anyone. Well, I'm happy to help you out, said the biker. Billy threw his bag deep into the sidecar and hopped on board. The biker revved up the motorcycle and shoved her in gear, using an odd-looking jockey shifter. Billy looked thoughtfully at the peculiar shifter handle as the two merged with the blacktop. A warm breeze touched Billy's face, making the desert heat dissipate away from his body. The biker shifted again, pulling on the lever, driving the cycle to higher gears. "A 48?" asked Billy. The rider looked at Billy. "Why, yes," he responded. "A 48. You seem to know your motorcycles." He got so few things right in life, and this rare victory made his chest swell. Having the right answer put Billy Kerrigan in an exclusive spot, at least in his own mind. Thinking from his penthouse view on the subject, Billy was completely unaware that from the balcony of his scant knowledge, he was overshadowed by mountains. His attention was once more drawn to the shifter. The metal was an odd conglomeration of blues, blacks, and chromes. The texture was unlike any metal he'd ever seen before. Adorning the top of the shifter was a skull. Tough guy, thought Billy. He'd dealt with tough guys his whole life. And as Billy knew full well, to deal with badasses, one had to be a badass. Billy gladly accepted the badass role, cherishing the hardened mantle bestowed upon him. Someone had to play the part, and he was it. Billy Badass. "Cute shifter," said Billy coyly. "Did the Grim Reaper give you this bike?" The rider let out a grunt as if to scoff at Billy's offhanded remark. "I wouldn't say that," said the rider. "I bought it myself many years ago." The rider was pleased by his answer, as if reminiscing from a long-gone era where bikers were real outlaws and highway bandits. These days, the intervention of doctors, lawyers, and businessmen into the rider's culture had somehow sanitized the relationship between bikers and the rest of the civilized world. They weren't bikers anymore. They were motorcyclists. "So how much you pay for her?" asked Billy. His legs stretched out comfortably in the sidecar, the wind smacking his face a little harder than before. The rider made another shift. That sounded like a change to fourth gear. Billy thought back a ways. Didn't Indian chiefs have a 3-speed? Billy dismissed the notion and leaned back, letting the warm desert air gently slap his face. Not getting an answer to his question, Billy took a different tack. "So what's your name?" Billy asked. "Did I say I have a name?" the rider shot back. Billy lost his words. What kind of an answer was that? This guy must be spoiling for a fight. "No, I don't suppose you did." "So what is it?" said Billy. "I go by many names," said the rider, gripping the handlebars firmly, his knuckles protruding from skin-tight gloves. "Yeah, I know how that is," Billy responded, sticking his hand into his pants pocket, feeling the shape of a switchblade. "Do you now?" inquired the biker. "You want to tell me more?" Billy fumbled for his next thought. That was an open-ended question, a wide-open question at that. Could the rider sense something was up? Could he smell bad odors of deception oozing from Billy's rotten pores? The dude was dressed to play the badass himself, and had probably seen and been in an equal number of scraps, at least as many as Billy. If the rider didn't want to give a name, who gave a rat's ass? Billy had other plans for this loser. Billy returned to his now stale, unanswered question. "So I'll bet a bike like this must have cost a ton of money." Billy shifted in the sidecar, and his body molded to the contours of the seat. Pretty damn comfortable, he thought. Better than a Rolls-Royce, in fact. Not that Billy had ever sat in a Rolls, or ever saw one at a distance closer than from a street corner. "You might say this bike is priceless," answered the rider, squeezing the handlebars as if they were an extension of his being. "This bike and I go way back. Way, way back." "Really?" said Billy, doubting whether way back could have been any more than 10 years. This guy looked no more than early 30s tops. So how far back could way back go? "I always wanted a bike like this," Billy continued. "My daddy always said the bike makes the man. He had an Indian chief too. Long time ago, in fact. He regretted ever selling it. In fact, maybe he owned this very bike at one time." "Maybe," said the rider, "but I doubt it." The chief motored on, bike and sidecar reaching a tolerable cruising speed. The windscreen did an effective job of diverting the air away from the rider, making his hair and features seem calm, as if standing still. Billy looked around. The desert cacti whipped by, and he appreciated the red mesas off in the horizon. Nothing had changed. This was still the bad Wild West, and outlaws ruled the range. He felt again for his switchblade. This was indeed a classic bike. and the bike always made the man. Billy imagined for a moment the pride of ownership he'd feel having a 1948 Indian chief with a sidecar, the rush of arrogance as he sat his ass down in the rider's seat. Maybe he'd own this very bike, but it wouldn't come without a fight. "So what brings you to these parts?" asked the rider. "And more especially, what are you doing in the middle of this stretch of highway? Hardly a soul on these roads. Hardly a soul anywhere." The rider's tanned skin rubbed against the sleeve of his white t-shirt. The bicep of his right arm flexed against the fabric, making the tattoo on his arm do a dance. It was a cheesy tattoo, Billy thought. Born to raise hell. How many punks had he seen in his time with the same worn-out phrase inked into their skin? None of the punks Billy ever met were able to conjure so much as a bat from hell, never mind raising all of hell from its dark depths. And besides, if this dude was ever able to raise hell, he wouldn't know what to do with its minions. "Oh, nothing brings me to these parts," said Billy. "Just a drifter passing through." Billy smiled. Fresh out of prison, he had nowhere to go. The road was his occasional friend, and soon this bike might become his forever friend. He fiddled with the switchblade in his pants again. The warm steel reminded him of its potential to bargain for almost anything. Knives were a second best when there were no guns, and Billy had great dexterity in a knife fight. Knives, when called upon to influence the action of others, could be a very effective bargaining tool. It just required the right master to wield them. Prison taught him well. "I would expect that anyone out here alone, hitchhiking, might be running from something, or someone." "You think I'm running from someone?" asked Billy, his voice crackling in accusatory tones. "Hey, you don't need to get defensive," said the rider. "It's just a question. Relax." "Well, let's say I was running from someone or something. What would you do about it?" "Nothing," said the rider flatly, his eyes squinting at the unraveling road before him. Billy smiled again. This guy wasn't as tough as he looked or acted. Maybe Billy could take this bike without a fight. Maybe he'd even steal the t-shirt right off the back of this punk. "So what did you do that put you way out here away from anyone?" The biker looked more inquisitive now. His speed adjusted at the asking of the question. "What exactly did you do?" he insisted, the speedometer ratcheting upward. "What if I told you I killed a bank guard during a robbery? How would that make you feel?" Billy dangled the question in the face of the rider, dying to see how he'd react. "I'd feel just fine," said the rider, his face showing no emotion, his fingers crushing the handlebars. An easy victim, thought Billy. He'd taken down many a man like this before, and the rider would be no exception. They were such simple meals for a man like Billy, all show and no go, no guts and no glory, and certainly not able to raise a bat from hell. Today the glory would be once again Billy's glory for the taking. "What else did you do?" asked the rider, seemingly unnerved by Billy's boasts. "Killed a guy in prison. They couldn't prove it, though. Another guy took the fall, and they let me out. Well, actually, I helped myself out." Billy waited to see the response on the biker's face. Any hint of fear, any hint of an emotion. The rider showed nothing. The rider's countenance looked bland, and not a hair was out of place. Billy looked at the cycle's speedometer. It registered well over 80, and their speed was climbing. The Indian chief's V-twin engine made an irritating blare from the exhaust pipes at that speed. Billy turned in his seat to appreciate the exhaust. That was strange. The exhaust was twisted like the roots of a tree, gnarled and curled around various pieces of chrome and steel, as if it had actually grown there organically. The twisting was far too elaborate to have been the product of some metallurgist's magical hands. Billy looked over the fendered wheel of his sidecar. The little Indian head at the crest of the fender was actually a light, and it was on. It gave off a soft red hue. Yes, he'd owned this cycle before the ride ended. His confidence grew in powers of 10. "Tough break," said the rider. "I mean for the guy who got framed in prison." "Yeah, tough break," Billy agreed, not quite sure why he failed to get the desired reaction of fear from this biker. He looked to his right and observed for a minute. The cactus plants whipped past at a startling rate, so much so that it felt as if he was aboard a jet airliner running down a runway strip. If there was any time to do it, now would be the time. Billy reached in and withdrew his knife, clicked open the spring-loaded blade, and pushed the edge to the rider's throat. "Here's the plan, Chief." You're going to slow this horse down, pull over, and give me the friggin' bike. No questions asked, and we go our separate ways. Got it?" The rider was fearful now, worry lines cascading over his forehead and face. "You don't want to do this," pleaded the biker. "Please don't hurt me." Just as Billy had expected. This guy was a total weakling, a coward, and a wimp. "I'll do more than hurt you if you don't pull over and give me the bike." He pushed the blade firmly against the rider's throat. Billy paused and checked their speed. The speedometer now registered beyond 120 miles per hour, the last number on the crystal face, and they were getting faster. The rider started to laugh in a guttural, threatening tone. Billy noticed something peculiar on the paint. The richness of the dark green seemed to move, seemed to crawl as if alive. It rippled in the wind like the fluttering of a flag, and Billy shut his eyes and reopened them again, attempting to dispel the illusion. Billy checked his bearings and could not acquire a reference point anywhere on the landscape. Everything was a blur now, racing past him at light speed. The rider laughed a riotous barrage of contempt at Billy. "What's so friggin' funny?" shouted Billy at this insolence, this blatant disrespect for Billy the badass. The laughter subsided and was replaced with the sound of tearing flesh. What the hell was going on? Billy turned to see the face of the rider. The flesh began to peel quite literally in chunks of skin that sloughed away. Cheekbones appeared, the eyes fell into their sockets, leaving hollows, and the skin of the biker's forehead ripped backward, taking the entire scalp with it. All that remained were the grinning teeth of a skull and two angry hollow sockets that glared at him. It laughed at Billy, laughed at him with a hellacious fury. Its fingers were reduced to bones, and the t-shirt that once hugged the rider's firm chest hung like a dish rag and flapped in the wind. "This can't be happening," screamed Billy. "Can't be happening. What the hell are you?" The biker made no answer and pulled on the jockey shifter to a higher gear beyond the specifications of the bike. Billy struggled for a bearing, unable to acquire a reference point. Only the blacktop before him and a darkened skyline is what he could find. The sun had disappeared and black clouds decorated the visible horizon. Billy rode the crest of a wave, breaking a land speed record. He sensed the feeling of quicksand. He tried to extricate himself from the sidecar, but the inertia and forward momentum kept him locked in place. The motorcycle was dropping, descending, gradually sinking like a submarine, taking Billy to crushed depth. He saw the front wheel dive into the asphalt, the front end smoothly swallowed by the racing blacktop. Oh God, why did he have to hitch a ride? How did he get so suckered? The panic fell over his body in steady waves, tingles of terror invading every nerve. Oh God, this is it. It's over. A searing pain welled up from his toes and spread to his feet. The pain shot up his legs. It was the sensation of traveling down a meat grinder as the pavement chewed up his limbs. The cycle continued its gradual descent, the skeleton beside him content with the ride down. Deeper they submerged. The rider raised a bony arm in triumph, its calcified fingers clenched in angry victory. Now Billy could feel his abdomen sanding away, his bones crunching in pain beyond all measures of scale. His eyes rolled up as if caught by a well-placed bullet aimed into the center of his forehead. His internal organs felt like twisted sausage links, the butcher next to him doing a fine job of reducing Billy to subatomic particles. The pain traveled up his neck, and he sensed as if his head was treading above hard black waters. His last feeling on earth was a tearing sensation from his head. The soul that once kept Billy Badass alive, now plucked from its body, another trophy for death. The remnants of the chief descended into the pavement, vanished from the world of the living. Only a red smear remained on the asphalt, a temporary reminder that Billy had once been part of the living world, but no more. Chapter 2. Dawn broke, bestowing her timeless beauty upon a red-capped mesa. A roadrunner scuttled along the blacktop, chasing a lizard. Desert animals stirred in their burrows to greet the welcome heat of the day. The rest was desert silence, no cars, and no signs of human life. Except for Tom McGurn. McGurn hated the current situation of being without a ride, once more loafing it in his lazy shoes, hitting the pavement, so to speak. McGurn not only hated his current situation, He was a man who hated the world and everything in it. He did, however, love money, and as for women, well, he tolerated them for carnal pleasures, nothing more. McGurn had even hated his parents from day one, much like the twisted instincts of a sick animal. Money was by far his best companion, no matter how he got it, just as long as he got it. Some people showed their hatred with words. McGurn best displayed his loathing in deeds. He committed his first double murder just shy of his 18th birthday. Not all murders were solved, and these two happened to slip into the cold case file drawer. Not a bad start for a badass. Not a bad accomplishment for a career down the dark side. Hitching a ride again. All he needed to do was make it to the next town, and he'd knock off a gas station or maybe a convenience store, then back to the gravy train he'd be. If only he could find another ride on this worthless stretch of dead highway. He hoisted his travel bag around his shoulder and started walking again. How long had he been on this road? A day at least, or so it felt. He drank the last of his water 8 hours ago, maybe more. Friggin' trucker. Asshole trucker left him off in a shit town of 28 people, plus or minus, and headed north with his food shipment. McGurn should have killed him on the spot. Should have shot him dead where he sat and taken that truck and sold off the food at the side of the road. That was how business was done. That was how Tom McGurn got ahead. He rubbed the fluid sweat away from the back of his neck and adjusted the brim of his cap. Outcrops of Paleolithic rocks surrounded McGurn on both sides of the road, convenient places for sidewinders and assorted scorpions to hide from the blistering rays of the desert sun. McGurn kept walking, facing little hope of a ride. Hours passed, and he'd seen no cars. He kicked the ground with his boots, displacing a few rocks, sending them to random destinations on the blacktop. If only he could find a ride. Pushing beyond the barrier of flanking outcrop, he looked ahead for options. Then he saw what looked like the rear end of a car protruding from behind a towering boulder. Was it a mirage? Was it an actual car? Probably an abandoned wreck, a useless derelict. No one in their right mind would stop there for a rest. Come to think of it, no one in their wrong mind would stop there either. Curiosity drew him nearer. Now he could see that it was for sure a car, a tuxedo black Chevrolet Nova with a set of side pipes. She looked fresh, as if ready to start. "Yee-haw!" shouted McGurn, his enthusiasm bouncing off the rocky walls behind. "Hot damn! Maybe this bitch'll start," he figured. To hell with hitchhiking. Now he could hit the road with style. An old chunk of Americana for the taking. But where was the owner? McGurn cautiously scanned the area for at least one, or possibly two people, but found nothing and no one. McGurn dropped his travel bag and put his eyes to the interior of the Chevy, searching for a sleeping owner in the back seat. He opened the driver's door. The hinge needed some grease, but he'd take care of that later. He sat in the bench seat. It fit most invitingly, and his body relaxed. His left hand reached for the wheel, his right hand for the shifter. Interesting shifting mechanism, he thought. The shifter was undoubtedly a Hurst, but the knob was not the usual billiard ball. Instead, a chrome skull decorated it. Cool, thought McGurn. He began familiarizing himself with the clutch and shifter. It had been ages since he played with four on the floor. He'd had a muscle car or two in his time, but they were mostly Bondo and rust, nothing of significance or value, and certainly nothing that was a head-turner except for a good laugh from a passer-by. He continued to play with the clutch and shifter like an obsessive-compulsive child. In minutes he'd reacquainted himself with the art of driving a stick. "You like her?" asked a voice from behind the boulder. McGurn sat paralyzed. There were rare instances in his life where he'd been caught with his guard down, and at this particular moment he added another one to that list. Yeah, said McGurn, the enthusiasm draining from his face. "What year is it?" he asked. The owner zipped up his fly and walked over. "She's a 70, and she's mighty fast. Not your average grocery getter Chevrolet. Got a 396 and a 4-speed Muncie, 12-bolt posi in the rear." "Sweet," said McGurn, planning his moves, making mental rehearsals on how this was all going to play out. "Hey, you need a lift?" asked the owner. "Yeah, a lift," said McGurn, his hands on the steering wheel, unwilling to let go. "No problem. Where are you headed?" McGurn pointed a wary finger down the road. "Just where I'm headed," said the owner. "May I?" he said, clearing his throat, waiting for McGurn to slide across the bench seat and let the owner behind the wheel. "No problem. Let me get my travel bag." "You mean this?" said the owner, the bag swinging by its strap from beneath his thumb. "Yeah, thanks." The owner tossed the bag to McGurn and slid in and twisted the key. The 396 big block engine snarled to the command of the ignition key, and the exhaust burped rudely from upturned zoomy exhaust pipes, 4 on each side of the front fenders. The two merged with the blacktop, picking up tremendous bursts of speed. The driver ripped on each gear with a power shift. "Fine car," said McGurn, emotionless, gripping his travel bag. He traced the outline of his 9mm stashed in the folds. A full magazine of hot lead patiently waited for instructions on how to proceed. "Yeah, real fine," said the driver, the tone of his voice somehow changing to McGurn's ear. He sounded pissed off. "So how long you had her?" asked McGurn, plotting his next move, a chess piece on this fresh playing board. "You sure are focused on my Chevy, aren't you?" grunted the driver. "You a car buff?" "Just that I know a hot car when I see one." "Yeah, hot," responded the driver, clutching the steering wheel and going to 4th gear. "So why are you out here?" he asked. "Just looking for a place to settle." "To settle? In the desert?" McGurn shifted uneasily in his seat. He hated questions. It reminded him of the many police interrogations he'd endured throughout his miserable life. "You ask a lot of questions," McGurn said. "Just trying to make conversation," said the driver, his tone a mixture of apathy and simmering hostility. "Just trying to make conversation," he repeated. McGurn didn't appreciate it. "Well, to answer your question, I'm looking for a small town to live in. I've tried the city and hated it. Now it's time for a change." "Oh, you'll find change out here," said the driver, smirking, his speed gaining rolling momentum. "Snakes, spiders, and coyotes are about all there is to keep you company. How's that for change?" "Just my kind of company," said McGurn. "Oh, really?" said the driver, adjusting his rear-view mirror. "Why is that?" "It just is," insisted McGurn. "Huh," grunted the driver, speeding on. McGurn withdrew his 9mm from the travel bag. The driver kept driving, his eyes fixated on the road, seemingly oblivious to the assault unwinding before him. "You might want to put that away," said the driver, his eyes never leaving the road. "I want this car and you're going to give it to me. I don't care if I have to kill you to get it. I swear I will." "You don't want to do this," said the driver, his tone flat and unfeeling. "The hell I don't. I need wheels to get me where I'm going, and these are it. Besides, I've taken a liking to your fancy hot rod. I think it fits right in with my image," said McGurn. "I've seen your type before," said the driver. "All show and no go. I ain't giving up my Chevy, not to you, and not to anyone." Their speed registered beyond the 100 mark. "Have it your way," said McGurn. He pulled the trigger. The first bullet hit the driver's face with violence and blew apart his left cheekbone. Mangled flesh ejected out the driver's window, sending a spray pattern of spattered blood over the headliner. The head now neutralized, McGurn pressed the barrel up against the driver's torso and let rip with 3 more shots into the chest, collapsing a lung and bursting the driver's heart. The body slumped and the Chevy crossed the double yellow line. The car weaved like a drunk, and McGurn fought to regain control. The manual steering box resisted McGurn's every attempt to stabilize the car, the Nova's front end hunting from side to side as if possessed by a psychotic spirit. The tires roared in anger at the loss of control, the back end beginning to fishtail. The driver's limp body slouched against the steering wheel, and McGurn tried to push the body away. The driver's limp torso resisted his efforts. It continued to fall back on the steering wheel as if, even in death, he refused to give up his genuine Chevrolet. At last, driving on the edge of adhesion, the rear end broke loose, and the Nova barrel rolled off the highway, flipping in violent 360-degree spins, dust flying and sparks of metal leaping. The steel roof grated against the blacktop like a belt sander. The Chevy stopped on its side, the windshield filled with veins of cracked safety glass. The dead driver had landed in the back seat, a gruesome passenger in his once proud street machine. His jaw flapped loosely like a door off its hinges. McGurn coughed at the dust that filled the cabin. Cuts marred his face, and he could actually feel the black and blue marks beginning to etch themselves into his flesh as welts formed all over his body. He wiped the dust from his eyes and saw his predicament. He kicked his foot to the shattered windshield, ejecting what remained of the busted glass. It fell away freely, and McGurn rolled out onto the hot desert sand. "Damn it!" he exclaimed. There went his ride. He'd been a fool to shoot while they were driving. How was it possible for him to have been so careless? He looked west, then east to reorient himself. West was where he was headed. He beat the remaining dust from his clothes and pulled his bag from the wrecked Chevy. His hand felt around the inverted headliner of the Nova's roof for his 9mm until he seized the handle. 4 shots. 5 remained as he took mental inventory of his ammunition. That was okay. He'd had another 4 loaded magazines in his bag in case he ever found himself in a hot situation. He spat at the crushed Nova, turned and began walking again. The noonday sun vomited waves of heat on McGurn, burning his fair skin, making his face mimic the solar fury above him. His tongue felt thick and dry in his palate. Not a car had passed him by in either direction since the wreck, and that had been more than 4 hours ago. Where the hell was everybody, he wondered. Did he miss something? Had the world ended and nobody told him? His body was 10,000 aches of pain, and he heaved heavy feet along the blacktop. He took stock of his life. What had he accomplished? Well, he had murdered. Murder was a fine art, and McGurn had graduated at the top of his class in this particular discipline. What else had he done? He had stolen. Theft was an easy subject, and McGurn obtained consistently high scores in the areas of armed robbery and burglary, too. Did any of his victims deserve their fates? Oh, yes. They'd asked for it, every last one of them. But why had they asked for it? They just did. But what about murder? Whoever asked to be murdered? Anyone who got in the way. Is that a fact? Friggin' right, it's a fact. And those who were robbed and beaten? Who volunteered to play the victim in that sideshow? No one volunteered, scoffed McGurn. They were puppets ready to be played and wiped out if necessary. Had they really asked for it? They all asked for it. That's how they are. Hey, need a ride? What was that? I said, need a ride? McGurn sat up, shaking his head, opening his eyes to a face presiding over him. Who the hell are you? Not very hospitable for someone offering you a ride out of this shithole, said the biker. McGurn searched the desert landscape. Where in the hell had he come from? McGurn's eyes hunted the horizon until they locked upon a green Indian chief in the distance. A virtual sunspot lifted right off of the sun's white-hot complexion. Was that a sidecar, he wondered? The sidecar surprised him. He'd rarely ever seen a motorcycle with a sidecar. Even in the hazy light, it looked inviting, almost tantalizing. But then anything was better than playing in the sand. Sorry, McGurn corrected. The sun's got me pissed off, that's all. Not a problem. So where you headed? West, said McGurn, picking himself up from the barren desert floor. What a coincidence. That's just where I'm headed, said the rider. I'll go get my bike. Fine, you do that. I'll wait right here, said McGurn. If the biker was headed west, that meant he had to come from the east. McGurn pondered the implications behind that last observation. Coming from the east, hadn't this guy seen the wrecked Nova further back? McGurn wondered. He had to have seen the carnage. It was right out in the open, as spectacularly obvious as a 10-car pileup. It made McGurn suspicious. Maybe the rider was an undercover cop, and McGurn had become part of an elaborate investigation. Or possibly this guy was an off-duty on his way to the donut shop. Either way, McGurn would handle the situation. He needed the ride. The rider disappeared for an instant, and so did the bike, confusing McGurn for their sudden and mysterious vanishing act until the two re-emerged from the arid squiggle lines of heat. Neat trick, thought McGurn. The desert was full of secrets and surprises. The old Indian chief motorcycle rolled to a stop, the sidecar luring McGurn to sit in the leather seat, urging him to let it ooze away the tension and enjoy the ride. Just throw your bag in, said the rider. McGurn hesitated, retaking mental inventory of his bullets. 4 magazines in the bag, but 5 bullets still in the handle, and the 9mm was on his person. That should do it. He complied and threw his bag in, its contents rolling deeply toward the bottom of the sidecar. McGurn jumped in, and they were underway. Nice bike, said McGurn, his bones becoming lazy in the seat. The wind rippled his fine hair, and he closed his eyes briefly, enjoying the desert heat. Thanks, said the rider, his tone curt and clipped. McGurn lusted after motorcycles, lusted after them his whole life. He knew the rarity of this current ride and puzzled in his own mind. Would this be something he'd like to have one day? Must have cost a small ransom of Inca gold to restore this Indian. He checked the paint, its deep green hue like the skin of a dinosaur, and possibly just as ancient. Perhaps the bike hadn't been restored at all. Restored or not, it made no matter. McGurn had already decided. He wanted the bike. So where you headed? Asked the biker, adjusting a pack of cigarettes rolled up under the sleeve of his T-shirt. Nowhere exactly, said McGurn, easing himself deeper into the sidecar seat. Oh yeah? Nowhere? Seems to me going west is at least somewhere. The biker shifted a gear and appeared thoughtful. Headed west, he continued. To me, that's definitely somewhere. The rider's voice was peppered with sarcasm, as if throwing down the gauntlet to challenge McGurn to do better with his answers. I'm on vacation, said McGurn, and people who vacation don't always have a place to go. McGurn paused to think of the absurdity of that last sentence. People plan vacations and they plan destinations. What he just said made no sense. He waited to see if the biker accepted his feeble excuse. No problem, I know how that is, man, said the rider. The two motored on, the rider shifting the skull knob jockey shifter to higher gears. So tell me about your life, Tom. A shock traveled through McGurn. He'd never told his name to this guy. So how did he know it? McGurn mustered his courage and asked. How do you know my name? McGurn demanded. The rider's startling intuition had cut McGurn deeply, as if a knife edge had sheared off part of his soul. The rider laughed. Would you believe that it was a guess? I figured you looked like someone named Tom, and I threw it out there to see if I was right. And I'll be damned. Got it right on the first try. McGurn settled a little. A rather amazing coincidence, but stranger things had happened, and the desert was always full of surprises. He settled back into an easy recline, enjoying the sudden burst of speed from this vintage bike. How fast were they traveling? He checked the speedometer. It looked like 80 plus from his vantage point. Fast bike. You're a fast driver, aren't you? Said McGurn. You might say that, said the rider. Man, oh man, what I wouldn't give to own a bike like this, said McGurn, making plans. Really? Questioned the rider. Well, just for sport, why don't you tell me what you would give? McGurn was surprised by the question. He didn't want to play games with this guy. He just wanted the bike, but he felt obligated to play, and by playing, he'd ease the rider into complacence. Then he'd strike. He considered the gravity of the question posed. So what would he give for a bike like this? The question left him hanging without an answer. He hadn't thought things through. What would he give? A car? A house? What? How about a car, said McGurn, tossing out the most likely piece of property. He considered it a fair exchange. That's a good start, said the rider. What kind of car? How about a Chevy Nova, said McGurn, testing the rider's reaction for any hint of betrayal about knowledge of the wreck. The rider smiled. Interesting choice. If you didn't have a Chevy Nova, what else would you give instead? The biker pulled aggressively on the jockey shifter, elevating the Chief to a higher gear. What about a trip to Disneyland, said McGurn, tossing it out to the rider for a laugh. Been there many times, said the rider. What else? A house, said McGurn. How big and where at? A mansion in Beverly Hills, McGurn chuckled. He was beginning to enjoy the game. Quite possible, said the biker, adjusting his speed upward to the tune of a newfound gear. But I was thinking something much bigger. Your most prized possession. And what might that be, said McGurn, amused at the hint behind the question. "A double cheeseburger and fries," laughed the biker. By now the momentum of the chief was blistering. The desert landscape whirred by them at a terrifying pace, faster than anything that ever lived there, or died there for that matter. Ahead, McGurn could see what evolved into a split in the highway, a two-pronged fork in the road. The fork was a hazy, faraway dot, virtually indiscernible, but definitely a fork. It shot off at 45-degree angles. The horizon to the left threatened black clouds and furious thunder, while to the right, McGurn could see a chain of mountains on fast approach. The yellow dividing line of the blacktop flashed like a strobe light as they neared the split. "Seriously," said McGurn, bothered by the mild joke, "is that all it would take to own this bike?" "Oh, we're going to get serious in a minute here," said the rider, his tone more ominous. "You're going to have to make a decision about which way we're turning up ahead. You make the right decision and the motorcycle is yours. No questions asked. I'll just simply sign over the ownership and walk away." McGurn watched the pulsating yellow stripes and pondered what exactly he'd gotten into. Could it have been that easy? Choose between going right or left at a road split and he could have the bike? It was absurd. And if I choose wrong, then what happens? The rider grumbled something unintelligible and hunched forward. "Choose," he commanded. McGurn started to sweat. This didn't feel right. Some hidden sense locked away inside him whispered danger. He felt for his gun. "I said choose," yelled the biker, his anger escalating to full-blown fury. McGurn choked on his words. He tried to speak, to utter a sound, but the blistering jump in speed made the rush of wind difficult to breathe. The jarring ride made his gun fall deep into the sidecar. All he was able to do was point a shaky finger to the right, hopeful that steering away from the black clouds to the left of the horizon was the correct choice. "Right you are," said the biker in a deathly rasp, then banked right. McGurn felt delirious, a mind-numbing sensation overtaking his conscious thought. The landscape stretched out before him and twisted in slow motion. The chain of mountains seemed farther away than before, yet at the same time they appeared larger. He looked to the biker. What sat there no longer fit the description of anything human. A hollow jaw hung low on the skull, flapping in the wind. The bandana that once wrapped the head of the biker had blown off, along with the rest of the flesh that once cloaked this awful being. McGurn tensed his legs and screamed. The Indian head on the fender glowed with a fierce shade of orange, lighting the way for biker and passenger to take one final ride into oblivion. McGurn's only instinct was survival. He had to get off this bike and end the ride. He fought valiantly to free himself from the sidecar, but the force of speed held him in place. The skeletal horror beside him seemed to laugh and castigate his efforts to be freed. The biker shook its head at McGurn, silently advising his passenger that there was no way, no hope of redemption. At last McGurn let go, resigned to his fate. He relived his time on Earth with the crystal clarity of a Swiss watch in his last moments. The murders, the robberies, and the mayhem. In each scene that was his life, he felt remorse for the pain he'd inflicted on all his victims. The mountains ahead filled McGurn with dread. Their size loomed at him in monstrous formations, drawing nearer with supersonic speed. Now the rocky outcrops filled McGurn's entire field of view. A massive wall of rock came up at him. In an instant, the motorcycle, McGurn, and the rider penetrated the outcrop, disintegrating into the metamorphic core. A red stain and nothing more trickled down the rock, McGurn's final graveside marker, his ultimate grindstone. Chapter 3. Frank heard a soft crunch beneath his feet. When he looked down, he saw a scorpion snap its barbed tail at his boot in retaliation for being stepped upon. The stinger sank into the leather of the boot, but failed to reach the skin. "Little bastard," said Frank, and finished the job. He stomped the scorpion out of existence. Frank Trellis was a man running from his past. Every man at one time or another ran from something or someone. No one was exempt from that, but some had more to hide than others, and the desert was an ideal place for just that. Frank had been in the desert for hours now, trying to hitch a ride. Another mile of walking at the shoulder of the road had sapped his strength and nearly sapped his will to go on. The desert sucked energy, taking what it needed from any life that dared challenge it to a game of survival. The desert usually won. The midday heat jumped off the pavement in microwaves of prickliness, making Frank bleed out what little reserves of water he had in his body. He found an old, empty roadside can. Must have been there for 40 years, maybe more, he figured, with very few signs of degradation. The label on it still offered refreshment, taunting Frank with a promise as hollow as the can. The desert preserved the record well, as good as any court stenographer, leaving a story for anyone willing to read it. Frank wound up for a kick and sent the can flying several yards ahead. It rattled in an odd way, as if trying to speak the secrets it held over the years. For miles ahead, the expanse of sand and cacti made Frank think. How was he going to make it to Los Angeles from this hell? There hadn't been a set of wheels on this road for nearly a day now, since he left his broken car at the shoulder, miles away, hours removed. The heat burned his tanned skin, blackening his arms and legs and crisping his face. He kicked the can again, transmitting his frustrations to the tin. There had to be a ride out here, somewhere, somehow. Off in the paltry shadow of a roadside rock, he caught the headlight of what looked to be a motorcycle. As Frank drew nearer, he heard the Indian chief's V-twin engine idling with a low, lusty burble. The chief and its master rolled out from behind the rock, the rider glowing with youthful blonde hair slicked in a ducktail and long sideburns. "You be needin' a ride?" he asked. Frank could not believe his luck. It was as if the rider had been waiting for him to come along. "You can be damn sure," said Frank, now taking inventory of the sidecar lashed to the old chief like an inseparable twin. "Get in," said the biker. "There's always room for one more." He smirked and extended his hand with an invitation to take a seat. "Thanks, man," said Frank, easing himself into the sidecar. "You look like hell. How long have you been out here?" "Too long," said Frank. "My junk heap broke down, and I've been walking this stretch for nearly a day now. You're the first living person I've seen all day." Yeah," said the rider. "Let's get going, shall we?" The rider slipped the chief in gear, and the two left the shoulder in a cloud of rising dirt. It was good to rest his feet, and Frank sensed the throbbing of his blisters. He extended his legs deep into the well of the sidecar, seeking a comfortable purchase. At last, a ride out of here. A chance to get closer to Los Angeles and a new life of living on a straighter path than he'd lived. The biker looked down at him and smiled bitterly, almost as if he'd read Frank's every thought. Trellis stirred in his seat. "So you belong to some outlaw gang?" asked Frank, taking inventory of the biker's tattoo that twisted and flexed on his bicep while the rider worked the handlebars. "Would it please you if I said I did?" The biker motored on, his eyes locked on the road, concentrating all of his efforts on what lay ahead. The lack of eye contact unnerved Frank. "I wouldn't care one way or the other," said Frank. "I'd just figure most bikers belong to some gang or whatever." The rider hunched forward and pulled on the jockey shifter, taking another gear upward. "I ain't most bikers," he snorted at Frank. A gradual torrent of wind began to race over the bodywork of the chief. Frank's hair flopped to and fro, and he squinted. This was a pleasure cruise compared to loafing it. He breathed in the sultry, dry air. "So where are you headed?" asked the rider, his voice competing over the increasing noise of the engine and the wind. "The City of Angels." "You believe in angels?" asked the rider. Frank paused to consider the depth of the question. He hadn't given it a thought. "No, not really," he answered. "It's all made-up bullshit. I believe in the here and now." Frank's eyes wandered over the landscape, seeking a steady landmark for his bearing. He fixed on a chain of red mesas that littered the land due west. "A reality-based man. I like that. Cold objectivity," said the rider, goosing the throttle and changing gears. "Are you an atheist, Frank?" A dreadful tinge ran through Frank. His mind made quick calculations, using a fast mental rewind to search for a reference point to where he might have mentioned his name to the rider. The realization came to Frank as a sharp stab. At no point had he ever introduced himself to this rogue rider. That made the feeling worse. "How do you know my name?" Frank asked, his apprehension escalating in tandem with his heart rate. "Would you believe it was a lucky guess?" said the rider. "You look like someone whose name would be Frank." "I do?" Frank wanted to accept the answer, but the bullseye made him fearful. "You do," pronounced the rider, his face looking gaunt, a shadow of his youthful self only minutes before. "You seem to know a lot about me," said Frank. "So maybe you can guess my last name, too." Frank Trellis knew this would be an impossibility, so he threw out the challenge. "Trellis," said the biker, looking down the road far ahead, taking another gear. Frank became queasy, his legs tensing at this impossibility. How do you know that?" Frank's hands jittered as he gripped the edge of the sidecar in response to a frightful gain in speed. The landscape began to blur. "Are you a good man, Frank?" Good man? What do you mean?" The rider chuckled, an unearthly laugh that seemed to echo. "It's really a simple question, Frank. Do you need a translator?" Frank was feeling nauseated. Was this some sort of trick? Was this guy a mind reader? "How do you know my name?" Frank insisted. He demanded an answer and did not want to be derailed with meaningless side issues and useless tangents. "Never mind how I know your name. Answer my question, Frank. Are you a good man? And be quick about it, because there isn't a lot of time." The rider's face was hollow now, the skin sagging badly, the eyes ringed with blackened circles. The look horrified Frank. What was this awful mutation? 1 minute a young buff biker and the next a husk of a man? This was unreal. Now the chief was hauling, and Frank watched the old telephone poles pass at a fantastical rate of speed, the wires dipping and rising with great rapidity from pole to pole, his only constant to remind him of the ever-rolling blacktop. "I'm waiting for your answer, Frank. I'm losing patience with you." "Yes," Frank shouted at last, "I am a good man." "And what makes you so sure?" said the rider, doubting his occupant. "I'm sure," said Frank, recounting the evil deeds done in his past. But those days were different. He had reinvented himself now and changed the way he viewed the world. He wanted a second chance to be a decent man, so that when his time came he could die without regret, without remorse. "I seriously question your honesty, Frank." The rider turned up the speed a notch. The landscape flashed by like blended yogurt. Frank's mind turned inward, reviewing his best and worst moments of his life. He'd never killed anyone before, but then again he'd swindled many out of their life's savings, murdering their financial health. He never assaulted anyone before, putting them in immediate fear of bodily harm. He'd donated stolen money to a charity once. He'd transported illegal immigrants for a fee, but hey, they were coming to a better life in the good old USA. On whole, he'd lived a pretty crappy life, but no one deed stood out as a crime against all humanity. Up ahead he saw red taillights coming at him at a tremendous rate. He looked to the biker and saw a decomposed face grimacing at him. Frank Trellis fainted. When he awoke, he was stuck in the sidecar, snarled in a traffic jam. Horns honked and engines idled, pissing away their gasoline. Stop and start, then stop and start again. It was a cavalcade of cars headed west. "Slow day," said the biker, his complexion robust and his hair pleasantly slicked back. But Frank Trellis had seen what lay beneath the facade, and it was no illusion. Frank's mind was clear as polished quartz. He knew what he'd seen. This was death, and it had come to take him away. "You're not too talkative, Frank. I've had better conversations from a sidewinder snake." This was Frank's only chance. He summoned all his might and pushed himself up, using his legs to spring from the sidecar. The rider stretched his arm to grab Frank's shoulder and push him back down, but missed, losing his grip to the desperate dash of his passenger. Frank fell to the pavement, and he rolled away. "Not very nice," said the rider, beginning to dismount his bike. Frank ran screaming from the chief, the squeals of a lunatic. The biker got back on the motorcycle and gunned the throttle, closing ranks with the taillights of a Chevrolet sedan. "You have to help me," pounded Frank at the window of the sedan. "Help me, please." The power window slipped down, and the driver evaluated this madman at his door. Frank had the wild look of a frightened horse. "You need some help?" Frank did not know where to begin. Truth had to be the first casualty here. No one would readily accept what he'd seen. "I need a ride to L.A.," said Frank, his voice resuming a more casual tone. He checked back to the biker, waiting to see if he'd made a move to apprehend Frank. The biker smiled and waved, giving Frank the nod, as if signaling the surrender of his quarry. Relief came over Frank like an invading army. The biker was letting him go. A reprieve. One more chance. He'd done it. He had cheated death. "I'm headed there too," said the driver. "City of Angels. Hop in." Frank got in and turned back, still watching the biker in anticipation of an end that seemed so inevitable. The motorcycle headlight veered off. The biker pulled a U-turn and wheeled the chief away from the gridlock. Rider and bike disappeared down the highway, fading from Frank's view. When Frank turned around to face the jam ahead, the vehicles had begun to move, and his new ride picked up the pace, moving with the flow of traffic. "Quite a jam-up," said the motorist, happy he had some company in the car. "Yeah," Frank agreed, half dazed, his mind still focused on the terror he'd experienced in the sidecar, his rational brain sorting and collating what he'd witnessed. With each passing minute, the thing on the bike became less real, more imaginary, a cardboard creation from some cheap movie. His mind reasoned through it, and before long he'd convinced himself it was only a nightmare. But nightmares only happened at night, didn't they? There would be bad dreams tonight, without question. "Well, we're moving," said the motorist. "I thought this traffic might never end." Frank realized that had it not been for the traffic snarl, he'd be dead now. As preposterous as it might seem, he'd be dead at the hands of an unearthly being, a collector of souls. Frank sank into the comfortable seat, content to ride shotgun and dream of California. "So how long you been out here?" asked the driver. The question snapped Frank out of an imaginary stroll along the streets of Beverly Hills. "Excuse me?" said Frank. "Out here, the desert. How long?" "Oh, just a day," Frank responded. "It's lonely out here. The desert, you know. Lonely. I've been out here a while myself." "Oh yeah?" said Frank, half interested. "How long?" "Seems like a millennium, maybe two." Frank laughed. "I know how that is. Been trapped in a small town myself for years, tied up there with little chance of leaving." Frank remembered his 5-year stint in prison for armed robbery, trapped in a small town jail, polluted with inmates and no chance for escape. But it was all behind him. The worst times disappeared from his own personal rearview mirror. The desert sun burned a fearsome orange, and it dipped by degrees toward the west. Frank laughed. "You're laughing," said the driver. "What's the joke?" "Oh, just the setting sun. It's like in a movie, you know, riding off into the sunset." "Yeah, only you're not the blonde chick I'd rather have riding with me in the passenger seat," chuckled the driver. "So what's your name?" Before Frank could answer, the driver said, "Wait, don't tell me. Let me guess. You're Frank, right?" It was like hitting a brick wall at over 100 miles per hour. Frank had a feeling, and it was all bad. "How did you know that?" "Lucky guess," said the driver. "Or maybe your wallet fell out of your pocket and I read your driver's license." The driver handed Frank his wallet, flipping it closed after he slipped Frank's driver's license between the leather. "Wear it in good health." "Thanks, man. I'd be screwed if I didn't have my ID." Frank slipped his wallet in his back pocket and relaxed at the passing scenery. The big-barreled Sargasso cacti rolled past at a respectable speed. Frank caught the speedometer needling its way to upper limits. Fast driver. "So where's the fire?" Frank asked. "No fire, just making good time," answered the driver. "Oh," said Frank, ending the inquiry. "So since you know my name, what's yours?" "I have many names," said the driver. "So you want to make me play the guessing game too, then, do you?" "This isn't a game," said the driver. A crackling sound like tearing paper projected from the driver's face. Pieces of earthly flesh sloughed away and fell to the seat, and blood stained the driver's clothing. Frank's legs were no better than a pair of prosthetic limbs, and his hands turned to icy blue-veined stumps. The thing looked at Frank and laughed. "You didn't think we'd let you get away, did you?" Its voice sounded deep and satanic. Frank's heart palpitated, thumping a new rhythm to the tune of his impending death. The Chevrolet sped on like a juggernaut, beginning its descent deep down into the blacktop. "Did you really think you could escape me? Look around you. Death is everywhere." Frank saw only short minutes left in his future. "Please don't take me," Frank begged. "I want to live. Please let me live," he sobbed. The mad skeletal thing beside him was now completely stripped of flesh, its jaw hanging in a hideous grin. It cared not what Frank wanted. Death needed another soul to feast upon. Good intentions never replace prior bad acts. Frank's last wish, that he could live his life over and do it all differently. Epilogue. Over 40,000 people die in highway-related accidents every year. Most people never see it coming. Death hides, death lurks, death pounces, then steals, taking another soul away from the living. Death can assume any form and be anywhere at any time. Death is a blacktop. Death is a broken traffic light or a fallen stop sign, and for those unlucky few who can see death shortly before it strikes, death can be the rider of a green 1948 Indian chief on US 66. Next stop, hell.